welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being on the panel. It's a thrill to be with every one of you and kind of blown away by everyone who's on the panel here. It's great. So I'm going to ask you to stay within about 3 or 5 minutes with your opening comments so that we can just have a lot of conversation with the people in the room. I know there's a lot of brilliance here, and it's always more fun to have the conversation, the dynamic conversation. But I'll start with asking you a question, and I will keep you to 3 or 5 minutes, so I'll do something if you're getting close. And it's a very vague question that hopefully allows for whatever you thought you were talking about. What are you working on, and what's exciting you about the realm of non-local consciousness right now? So why don't we start with Neil?
Tick, tick, tick. I'm working with Minas a lot. Sort of actually coming at things that you were quoting Edgar Mitchell with a very, very different perspective, because you're still putting matter and energy and then consciousness side by side. And we're asking the questions which are not foreign to Western philosophical thought, let alone Eastern experiential stuff, that what if consciousness is what everything, matter and energy, space and time, are actually emerging from, which is a very different sort of question. And both of us feel like while that is given plenty of attention in a lot of different philosophical traditions, it has not received a formal statement that can be mathematized, which is his job. And that can inform development of a proper theory rather than just different observational stances.
I forgot to say who you are and where you're from.
I'm Neil Thiessen. I'm a liver pathologist. So what do I have to say about anything like this? But that got me into stem cell biology, which got me into complexity theory, which got me into notions of a self-organizing universe. And I'm also a senior Zen student at the Village Zendo in New York, and a practicing Jew type, and I do a little shamanic stuff. So I'm trying to and I'm not trying to find a way to bring it together. It just seems to be accumulating together spontaneously.
Thank you. And so in this realm, you're working on a mathematical theory of non-local consciousness.
First, a formal statement of what the world would look like if we took that as the perspective.
Okay.
And then where can we go from there?
Thank you. Okay, John.
Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very parallel. My sort of big picture work is understanding the foundations of the universe and foundations of consciousness and seeing if we can quantitatively construct, and I believe much of the work of this is already done. It's a question of putting it together. A functioning view of the universe in which consciousness is all that there is, universal, immortal, non-changing, indivisible wholeness of consciousness, but within that one structure of the wave function of the universe, can you compute and actually see the emergence of a multitude of perspectives that appear to be changing and evolving within the continuum of totality that is beyond time? And I think we're very, very close to that. And within that, we have answers, promising answers to the collapse of the wave function and other mysteries that have been, a little tough to truly get our hands on in the past. And then more specifically, we're all aware from Dean's talk and other research that I've been involved with and others, that there are field effects of consciousness. And those field effects of consciousness can even be put to practical use, even world-transforming applications in terms of societal peace and reduction of violence and warfare. I'd like to understand more specifically in greater detail how that happens. And later on, if there's time, I'd like to reflect and pose some questions to Dean, which I really loved about his research, and see if I can get a little clarification on some of the specifics of what's going on, probably offer some reflections there. So this is great.
Excellent. I like the after introduction. Would you like to tell people who you are and where you're from?
Oh, I'm John Hagelin. I'm a quantum physicist, but fundamentally interested in research in consciousness and higher states of consciousness.
Thank you. Okay, Rudy, I'm going to go to you because Menace is your side guy here.
So I'm Rudy Tanzi. Oh, that's loud. And I'm a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and vice chair of neurology at Mass General Hospital. And mainly what I do is research Alzheimer's disease, but became interested in the area of consciousness especially upon writing a book called Superbrain with Deepak Chopra a few years ago. And much of what I like to think about is what does Alzheimer's teach us about who we are? Because if you can look at what happens to an Alzheimer's patient, which is of course a terrible disease, what does that teach us about self? And when Alzheimer himself first described his patient in 1906, after the interview, she broke down and kept saying, "Dr. Alzheimer, I've lost myself, I've lost myself." And just, to put a lot of thought into just a few words, self requires the continuity of time. It requires context in space. It requires associating what you're sensing with what you already know. That's what learning is. Learning is all based on association. So space and time, local consciousness is based on memory. Non-local consciousness removes space and time. And the interesting thing is, if you look at a late-stage Alzheimer's patient, they're taking in information and it's not being stored in that first memory area, the short-term memory. Normally we take in information, it's in our short-term memory. If you get good sleep, have slow-wave sleep, it gets stored on your hard drive as long-wave memory, long-term memory. And in Alzheimer's disease, in the latest stages, the actual neuronal inputs to short-term memory are severed. So all this sensory information is coming in the moment, and you're perceiving it, but you can't store it. So there's no context in space. There's no context in the past. There's no continuity of time because you can't keep track of what happened even 5 seconds ago. And in some aspects, that sounds like, wow, that's really living in the moment. But if you're not there to know it, right, if there's no context in space and time, it's just basically an experience in the moment without self. So these are the things I think about while I'm doing my research, is self requiring space and time. And if you want to enjoy the bliss of non-local consciousness, yes, it's okay to escape that continuity for a moment, but you need to get back to it to know you were there and enjoy it. And that's what you lose in Alzheimer's disease.
And did you have...
Yes. So I was going to, I don't know if there are more, but I was going to show one slide.
Sure.
That I think illustrates the idea of local and non-local consciousness, and then I was going to ask Manas to comment on how it works. But we can do that later if you want.
Okay, let's make our round and I'll come back to you. Okay, Julia.
Do you know that your slide, I think your slide is up right now.
Oh, it's up. There it is.
All right,
Should I
let's
just
do it now then.
Okay, so if you look at this slide, it's an interesting optical illusion, right? So if you can click once, the first bullet. So the wheels appear to be rotating, but of course, as you know, this is a still picture. And I think it really, for me, captures this idea of local and non-local consciousness, because you have something that's still, that looks like it's moving, and as soon as you observe one wheel, it doesn't move anymore, right? If you try that, just let it move, and now look at one wheel and it stops. So next bullet. So the idea is that in local consciousness, in space and time, everything appears to be moving around you in space and time, but when you observe it, it's still. But if you click the next bullet, in non-local consciousness, the fact is they're already still. It's always still. So it gets the point across that if you take away space and time, in total sea of consciousness, everything's done. It's still. But we are contributing to what's already done. In other words, it's happening at the same time. We're contributing to the sea of consciousness with all our interactions, because there's really no space and time, but at the same time, it's already completed. So I think this is it's a nice optical illusion to show stillness and movement at the same time, but in the end, in the reality, it is all still. So now, Manas will explain it to you.
Thank you, Rudy.
Yeah. Well, you wanted that.
This was done on the spur of the moment.
Yes, we just had this idea to do this together.
I talked a little bit about it last night in the plenary. The idea, of course, that already John and Rudy and Neil cover is that we start with the premise of underlying consciousness has been foundation. And then the big mystery, or the one that's appropriate for our human condition, is how do we become individual selves? So the self and the self, we confuse the two terms. When I talk about consciousness, I usually write it as a big S, and when I talk about individual self with a little s. Space and time seems to be fundamental, and certainly we do physics in space and time. But what it seems to be happening is that if you have objects, then you can measure space, then you have space on horizon. If you have things happening, events, as in relativity, then you have time. Without objects and without events, you don't have space and you don't have time. So space and time are not primary, they're secondary. They're primary once you have individual selves, once you have objects and subjects. And as Rudy just showed with this trick on the screen, and by the way, the whole universe is a trick. It's the great magician is the great consciousness, and she plays infinite games of a trick. Basically, what you're doing is by focusing attention. And in fact, in quantum theory, we have this quantum Zen effect. That's the equivalent thing. Then things get frozen. Then you get the individual appearance. But in fact, it's always still. It's just the focusing that gives you individual. And of course, the individual works in space and time. So space and time that physicists assume and take for granted is not primary. It's primary once you have objects and subjects. Definitely it's primary once you have objects and subjects. But before that, prior to that, you have the infinite sea of consciousness, and there, without boundaries, space and time don't really exist.
Yeah, it sounds very much like the, when people really rest deeply into observing the nature of their being, they find a stillness. They find a deep vastness and stillness, and this seems to be very common. Is this kind of what you...
Right.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thank you. How about you, Julia?
So I'm going to follow the rules, Cassandra. My name is Julia Mossbridge, and I work at Northwestern as an experimental psychologist and neuroscientist. And as a child, I became very fascinated with time because of a series of precognitive dreams that I had, and that brought me into the world of trying to understand how time works. And only recently, maybe in the past 10 years, I guess, did I realize that trying to understand how time works is the same thing as saying, I want to understand deep consciousness or fundamental consciousness and its relationship with everyday waking consciousness. Because in fact, Minos, as you were saying, you corrected yourself. You said, prior to, no, first I think you said before this, and then you said, well, prior to it, because you realized you were using a temporal word. We can't not use those words because they're such an integral part of our experience. And I'm fascinated by that, and I'm fascinated by the fact that they're integral and yet they're fabrications. And so what I want to understand is this handshake between our waking conscious awareness and all these non-conscious processes that seem to be in touch with the fundamental aspects of reality. And that handshake, I feel like scientists or traditional sort of mainstream neuroscientists tend to minimize the fundamental reality part, and that mystics tend to minimize the waking conscious awareness part. But obviously they're both important, or we wouldn't have both of those experiences. We wouldn't have the experience of temporal flow, first this happens and then this happens, if it weren't important. And we wouldn't also start to be able to understand this concept of timelessness and fundamental consciousness if that weren't important. So why do we have both, and why do we have this connection? That's what I've been thinking about lately. And I'll leave you with this experience I had the other day. I had just had lunch with Mark Beeman, who is a colleague of mine at Northwestern, who studies insights and how do insights happen in the brain. And I was thinking along the lines of, well, where do insights come from, and how does that talk about the relationship between this handshake relationship between conscious awareness and non-conscious processing? And the next day, I was talking to a friend, and she asked how my son was doing because he just started high school. And I said, oh, he's on the debate team, and it's really exciting. They're doing this debate about how taxpayers, or whether taxpayers should, and then I forgot the word. I forgot the verb. Whether taxpayers should, and then I was like, pay money towards, what's the word? Put money towards, I was very uncomfortable because I couldn't understand the word. The question was, should taxpayers subsidize, which is the word I couldn't remember, stadiums or not, right? I spent the whole rest of my time with her trying to dig that word out of the back of my brain, and the words that kept coming into my head were euthanize and eulogize. Okay, so the thing is, I had an opinion. The reason those words came into my head is because I had held a conscious opinion that the word I was thinking of started with the letter E, which was incorrect. But anyway, I had a very strong opinion it started with the letter E. So what is the non-conscious process of my brain, or people might call it deeper consciousness here? What does it do? It gives me two words that start with an E, so I can be happy that they start with the letter I thought they did, but end with the right suffix, so it can lead me towards the right answer. So there's, to me, a very gentle relationship. That's a demonstration of this unbelievably gentle relationship between these non-conscious processes and this conscious awareness. This individual conscious awareness says, I know what's going on, and the non-conscious processes say, we're going to make you think that you do know what's going on. So I'm fascinated by that.
That's good. Thank you. Good.
I'm Dean Radin, the Chief Scientist at the Institute of Nordic Sciences, and what's on my mind is last week I was at a conference talking about precession of the equinox and ancient knowledge. And it reminded me that we sometimes think that modern civilization is roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years old, but there are already artifacts that are found that are 10,000 and more years old. So this goes back to the last ice age, approximately, and it suggests that since ice ages come around every so often, that perhaps we're in the process now, especially if you take the point of view of the yugas from the Vedas and other traditions, that we're on a cycle, and that depending on where you think we are in that cycle, we might be on an uptick. If we're indeed on an uptick, then if you look from a historical perspective of where science roughly started, 300 to 500 years ago, and where we are today in this discussion, it has been extremely fast. So sometimes when you're in the depths of you're struggling with figuring out how things work, and you're dealing with skeptics and dealing with getting funding and all the rest of it, which is difficult, I try to step back from that and see how much progress has actually been made to have consciousness study itself, and it's been very, very fast. So I'm pleased about that. And then the second thing is, if the acceleration continues, if we're on some kind of a curve like we've seen technology expanding very quickly and our understanding of consciousness increases just as fast, then we're talking about a major disruption in how civilization works. And anytime there's a disruption, sometimes there are good parts and sometimes there are not so good parts. So I tend to be optimistic, and I'm looking forward to the good parts. It has to change things dramatically. I'm not sure I know or would look forward to the bad parts, but that's part of change. So I think I don't know if we're at the knee of the curve or not, but I think we're getting close.
Good. I know, John, you said you might have a couple of comments or questions for Dean.
Oh, sure, absolutely. And we could benefit from a whole, as you once suggested, a session where we bring some quantum physicists together and explore some of the implications of your research and the field effects of conscious research. Just a couple quick questions, because they're very interesting to me from my quantum mechanics perspective. Firstly, you were able to show in many experiments, including the one that you just presented to us on the double slit, a diminution of the sharpness and height of the fringes, the interference effects went away, which would be the result if we could somehow, by intuitive knowledge, pose the question as to which slit the photon is going through. And that in itself is, obviously a very, very important thing to show, that we, with our minds from a distance, can act as a quantum observer without necessarily being there probing your experiment with the Geiger counter or something like that. The next thing you showed I found thrilling, but in my opinion much more radical, and that was the, what's the word? The asymmetry in the pattern. The asymmetry in the pattern suggests that not only are we making a measurement in determining whether or not the photon passed through one slit, we are actually somehow encouraging the photon to pass through one slit. We are sort of steering the outcome of the effect, steering the outcome of the collapse of the wave function. And that would be a fabulous thing, to continue to follow up on, because things like long-range field effects of consciousness, where you need to send an influence, hopefully purely quantum mechanically to a distance, you could do it this way. At the same time, steering the collapse of the wave function really flies in the face of our clinging to relativistic causality, because you can use that to create effects faster than the speed of light without the addition of any classical signal, which I typically feel is necessary. So it's big. It's not only collapsing the wave function with your mind, it's also steering the collapse of the wave function, which would put the human person being in a very powerful position in the universe. And I just want to distinguish, because to me it was so striking, the difference between those two. And the latter is really novel to me, and I'd love to see that pursued. The final second comment is to do with you putting your detector at a node of the interference pattern, and you were able to kind of amplify the sensitivity of your experiment by looking at some place where there should be no photons and seeing a statistically significant number of photons. That raises a question I have about it, and I don't know that it's settled yet, and that is, that effect could come through the decohering effect of the observation itself, and that would be to do with the collapse of the wave function with your mind. But it could also come by taking your whole interference pattern and shifting a little bit to the left or to the right. And that could be achieved with what's called a small, interference term, or small external term, by the application of a small force, some kind of electrical force that could steer your wave pattern one way. And even if you steer it a little bit, because you're at the bottom of a fringe, you could see a significant effect. So that experiment by itself doesn't settle a question I'd love to see, and perhaps it has been considered, and that is the effect due to a physical influence of some kind, a field that is applied to the whole device, which with the screening and stuff you have seems to be a little more difficult to accept. Or is it due to the collapse effect of the wave function due to measurement? And I'm not sure which, but it's important for me to know which.
Yeah, we don't know which either yet. I think recently, because of interest in entanglement steering, and in particular in how the quantum Zeno effect might be able to steer a system, that we may be dealing with something where the idea of passive perception changing the system and active pushing on it are actually the same thing. At a deep enough level, observation and action are the same. So or maybe they're complementary, or they're intertwined, or something like that.
Well, I believe that probably is true, just the way you put it. It's just that one infuriates Einstein and the other one is okay. And one gives us superhuman abilities and the other one gives us a little less such power. So that's a really interesting thing to pursue.
Yeah, and of course it has very strong pragmatic reasons too, that in people who do distant healing, oftentimes will imagine it as there's something going and pushing. Yeah. If that's in fact the case, and yes, we have superpowers. I think we do anyway. But to actually know the difference, to have a way of figuring out in an experiment to distinguish between the two, I don't know how to do that yet. So that's why I think a panel where we work out over a week with theoretical physicists how to do that, that would be fun.
We can do that. That'll be fun.
This is what I love about my job now. Is it the observer effect or telekinesis? I don't know. Well, I think we should open the floor because the conversation always gets much richer when we include everyone. So we've got one question here. Do we have another microphone or do we have the only microphone?
Thank you. I have been a layperson. I've been an engineer, so not a quantum physics specialist or a biology specialist or a psychology specialist. But I've been following this movement for the last 15 years. And it seems to me that, between the body and the universal consciousness, there may be another entity. and some call it the subtle body, causal body, the mind, and so on. And that's what talks in both directions. Now, if this were true, wouldn't the movement, wouldn't this new science want to peg the model of the mind, be it from Patanjali's point of view, but by peg it I mean develop a serious theoretical model and an experimental model, both from biology and physics. And shouldn't that be the next goal in this community?
I'll just make a comment. If the idea of let's say a soul body, right, or an astral body, it's still working in, you would still think that they're working in time and space, but at a different vibration or frequency. So it's kind of like, if you think about the second hand on a watch as it goes around, our consciousness is we're living very close to the center of the watch. So as the second hand goes around 1 full minute, we don't travel much distance. You can think about other assemblies of consciousness beyond the one we experience here as being further out at the edge of the second hand. So in the same amount of time, you're traveling a much greater distance. So the vibration, the movement, the frequency is much faster. But it's all one continuum of movement. And I like to, and I don't know, I mean, I agree with you, scientifically it'd be great to have me not sound like an idiot right now, that of a soul body or an astral body, the idea of what we call a physical body, all as assemblies of consciousness at different vibrations. I'm hoping, 500 years from now we'll understand this all, but we have to begin now to at least take seriously addressing that question. And I think that's a great comment. When? 20 years? That's cool.
I personally think 5 years ago, but this is actually how I started moving into this area, because as a pathologist, I spend my day looking at people's biopsies under the microscope. I'm used to seeing people at the cellular level just as comfortably as I'm used to seeing people at this level as distinct objects. And when you start, take it up a level of scale. You see a flock of birds from a distance, it looks like a solid thing. And if you don't realize, until the moment you realize it's birds, you're like, what's that UFO in the sky? And then you realize, oh, it's birds. So at one perspective, it's a thing, even though it's moving. At another perspective, it's actually a flock of smaller things. And all of our bodies, at a lower level of scale, are just communities of cells that are self-organizing, only 1% or so of which are human, and the rest are bacterial. If you go down to the biomolecular level, those cells aren't a solid thing either. They're simply a phenomenon arising from the interactions of smaller things, biomolecules and atoms in aqueous solution. And if you go down to a smaller level of scale, then you're in the quantum realm where non-locality really predominates. I was talking about this stuff at a conference with Tibetan medical people, and the Dalai Lama was there, and some of his personal physician, and etc. And when I was describing this, they were sort of like, well, of course, you're talking about coarse body, energy body, subtle bodies, etc., etc. So what we came to in talking to each other was that we're used to, in our system of society, is thinking of ourselves as discrete objects. Western medicine and biology is the notion that all living things are made of cells, and at that level of scale, we aren't things, we're actually communities of smaller things, but you can keep extending that all the way down. And one of the things that's particularly interesting is that at this level of scale, this is my boundary, and so we're separate. But if you go down to the cellular level, I'm leaving bugs all over the place, and you're picking them up, so there's a community of stuff going on. And
it's nice right before lunch, Neil. Thanks.
Yeah.
And at the molecular level, well, stuff I'm breathing out, the plants are breathing in, pheromones, sweat, hormones, all sorts of things. And at the subtler levels, in the quantum levels, apparently, things are happening even further out. So the boundaries keep extending out the smaller you go in scale. So the notion of the self, at this level of scale, this is myself. At the cellular level, this self doesn't exist. At the molecular level, at the atomic level, there's no atom in your body that you didn't drink, eat, or breathe from the planet. So we're not really individuals, we're just the planet that's self-organized into little creatures that think they can talk to each other. But we are all Earth, just an animate version of product living on the surface and somewhat of the way down. So to some extent, I think the problem is that biology is so rigidly stuck in living things are made of cells, and that's it. And the non-Western traditions say, well, actually, there are all sorts of bodies, and they all exist simultaneously. You can only choose to look at one or the other at any particular moment, but they are all present in a superposition, in a quantum-like superposition, Manas and I would say, at the same time. And that's a way of drawing all these things together, I think.
May I add a comment to that as well? I think for anybody who has, and quite a few in this room have, I'm sure, quite a few, found themselves in an out-of-body experience where we're moving around in a vehicle that is subtler, more ethereal than the physical body, you can't deny the presence of that. I mean, if you haven't had the experience, sure, you could deny it, but for those who've had it, you cannot. So there's so many people who have, I'd like to take it almost as an empirical starting point that there is such a thing. As a physicist, the first question in my mind comes, well, what's it made of? And it's a little difficult in terms of the known particles and forces to imagine what it could possibly, because none of them work. But in string theory and M theory, you do have additional forms of matter called hidden sector matter. Now it's called shadow matter, which is matter that fills this room, lives in 3 dimensions like us, but doesn't interact with us. The understanding was it doesn't interact with us at all. But it does if you carry through the whole thing carefully. This hidden sector matter has minute electric charge and therefore does interact with us very weakly electromagnetically. Now, so I believe this hidden sector body or hidden sector bodies are a very important component of what we call mind, and even mind after death or mind outside the body, and even field effects of consciousness for a reason I'll just quickly get to. What do we know about this hidden sector matter? Well, it likes to form bodies, at least what are called solitons or bound states that are very rich and complex. They cling to us, but can be removed from us. They have qualities like scale invariance, which could make them very important in experiencing deeper, subtler, smaller levels of reality that our physical mind made of neurons probably could not. And finally, the thing that's interesting to me is that it's they fill this room, this type of shadow matter. It's a candidate for what's called dark matter as well. Well, that link hasn't been clearly established. It would be a contributor to what we call dark matter. But it's cold. The hidden sector world is a very cold world, between 1 and 3 degrees on the absolute scale of temperature, which is interesting because it's a superconducting world, a superfluid world. And one of the things we need for these side effects, I think, and for field effects of consciousness, is we need long-range entanglements. And entanglements get muddled up pretty quickly in our high-temperature world. But in a quantum computer or in a superconductor, you reduce the decohering effects, the thermal random effects of temperature by cooling the temperature a lot. So if we are communicating not so much through a physical expression, but through a connection between our hidden sector bodies, those hidden sector bodies are much likelier to hold entanglements over much longer periods of time and much longer distances. And those entanglements are going to be necessary, I think, to explain if any of Dean's or research or other research on collective consciousness. So I think it's promising. I wouldn't put it 500 years away. I wouldn't even put it 20. I think it might be 10.
Thank you. Good. Lots of people, yeah.
Another thing that happens in scientific revolutions is dissimilar things are shown to be similar. Like in quantum mechanics, the matrix mechanics and the wave mechanics were shown to be similar. And the guy who got left off the slides was de Broglie, who came up with the de Broglie wavelength, showing that a particle has a wavelength. And in electricity and magnetism, they were united into electromagnetism. Is there anything in this revolution that is seemingly dissimilar, but might turn out to be the same thing?
I'd like to speak to that. I think, Dean, because I didn't see that you were going to speak to that, so I'm going to speak for you. What you were saying about perception and action potentially being the same thing, I think that's really key.
Minus? Yeah.
You can say that what appeared to be separate things in the past now are coming together. John and I were just chatting about perhaps just mentioned wormholes and non-locality. So basically, as we try to bring together general relativity and the quantum theory, which is the holy grail. I mean, this is the home run whenever it happens. A lot of these issues will probably be resolved at the physical level, and it's probably around the corner. But because of the different mathematical foundations of standard quantum theory and general relativity, has been a bearable problem. And this is, I think, the issue that John has addressed. So in terms of the mathematical models, I always like to go back to the mathematics because it is the language that we use to communicate with nature. And it's also found at very subtle levels, and all the way as close as possible to the absolute consciousness, but not quite all the way to the top. I don't think it's going to be much longer either. It's just that perhaps making a comment to the previous question, a certain amount of humility would be great to be here because we say, well, science is the answer to everything, but there are these ancient systems which are very scientific, like Vedanta and Shaivism, very, very scientific in the sense of logic. Actually, if you study them, the logic is impeccable. So I think there can be a two-way dialogue. We learn from them, and not that they learn from us because they're already there, but you see what I'm saying. To really to take the next leaps or move forward is to take those ancient systems seriously and rather say, oh, well, it's just, this is the way they were talking back then.
I'm happy to hear this is going to happen sooner than later. Your biologists all have physics envy. Now I have even more. So
Right.
Hello? I was going to mention that quantum entanglement from elementary particles, yes, is a very fragile thing, but there's rising interest in something called quantum discord is also interesting because from an informational point of view, it's the same as mutual information.
Right.
And there, it's not fragile at all. And not only is it not fragile, but that it demonstrates that systems can be entangled to various degrees, all the way from the level of certainty at elementary quantum entanglement all the way up to no entanglement at all. And I know that this within the quantum computing world is becoming interesting now because it offers a way of doing quantum computing without superconducting systems, thereby making it possible for you to carry it around with you rather than having to carry around a jug of liquid nitrogen as well.
Good. Yeah, there's someone over here who's wanted to ask a question.
You're well hidden, sir.
Since 1970s that Gaia theory was accepted, by the science community, even though the system theory explains how the living system works, the new findings of those has not been applied to this issue of Gaia theory. I would like to know why the Gaia theory is not going, we are not using those new theories of self-organizing system to be able to find out that the whole universe is a living system. And by knowing that and how it behaves non-linearly, we can behave much better in the digital world that is daily because we process our activities, social, economical, and everything through this non-linear network of internet. They are becoming non-linear and subjected to chaos and instability, but at the same time, self-governing and self-organizing. So how come we are not using that concept of, how come the scientists are not paying attention to Gaia theory and expanding that through the new knowledge of system theory and fractal and others like...
Well, I think
Did you
some
understand?
people are. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the big problem the non-local microphone. my experience of starting to apply this to stem cell theory, when we started talking about it, it came about because of an interdisciplinary interaction I was having with an artist. And she introduced me to this stuff, and we started writing about it. And other than immune system, people hadn't been applying it to the cell biology level. I think the real issue here is that to apply it well, you have to have a level of expertise and mathematical understanding that most scientists, having spent their time training in this, are not prepared to take on. And I think that one of the transitions we're really working towards is that the 21st century is about interdisciplinary activities. One person isn't likely to solve any of the problems we're talking about. It's going to take... Thank you. It's all about this kind of interaction. I couldn't do what I'm doing in this realm if I didn't have a quantum physicist at my elbow, and now I have two. But at the same time, when Minas first heard me talk at one of the meetings, he was looking for a biology thing, but it wasn't within his realm. It took two people having that conversation. So I think the more we do in an open-ended way to foster interdisciplinary activity, not with a goal in mind, but just to get bunches of people together. And I think complexity systems thought is definitely part of that. But it should also be artists and contemplatives and physicists and biologists and engineers, etc. That's where our progress is going to take place.
Yeah, it strikes me one theme among these questions and the answers is this idea of complementarity, and that I know that many of you are thinking a lot about this, but how do we have things exist at the same time? How do we have things that are not logically compatible exist at the same time, relativity and quantum mechanics, and how do we have complexity and systems theory enter into it, and how do we look at things in a new way so that what used to be opposites are actually fundamentally the tension between them is creating exactly what we're looking at.
And a lot of it comes down to funding. The reason I was able to stumble into this is because the Wellcome Trust in the UK, they're interested in how the most creative solutions come from interdisciplinary stuff. So they wanted to create interdisciplinary groups that they could study which ones were creative and which ones weren't. So they simply paid us money. Jane Prophet was the artist I was working with, and we just got paid to talk to each other. She flew to New York 3 times, I flew to London 3 times. We didn't even have to submit a report. But they had to film everything we talked about so other people could study how we spoke to each other. And it was just, there was no goal, and that's a real key thing. We weren't driving towards something. We were simply learning each other's languages. And out of that, bottom up, things started happening. And then our group grew to include 3 other people. And it's transformed all our careers. That sort of structural thing that groups like IONS, for example, helps to serve. I think that's the way the future is. And it's not an NIH kind of model, alas.
I think a good example is genetics. You know, as a geneticist, we would always just study one gene at a time. Now you have to study networks, sub-networks of genes together, systems biology. Epigenetics, in terms of gene activity, is as important or more important than the genes you inherit from mom and dad. And you have to look at how one gene up or down affects another gene up or down, and look at tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of different genes' activities to understand events in biology. These are self-organizing systems. The activity of one gene recursively affecting another gene and another and another, and you really can't do genetics today without doing that. So we're seeing the infiltration of these thought processes, even without thinking about it, into biological systems as well.
Yeah, the evolution, I'm sorry. The evolution of science seems, how science is done seems to me to go like this, and so you have times when there's a lot of focus on generalists. So people should be well-rounded and should learn mathematics and science and art and music. And then we have just been going through this several hundred-year period of specialism, I can't even say the word. I hate it so much. But anyway.
Euthanizing.
Eulogize, that's what it is. Exactly. Anyway, we've gotten to this point where you can be slapped down on a grant panel at NSF or NIH if you've done any research that's not related to the thing that you are applying for your grant for. But we're starting to get out of that. So now when students come into the lab and they say they're studying psychology and they're a little upset because we asked them to learn computer science, we say, sorry, but that's the way it's moving now. You better know a lot of computer science because you'll be analyzing very complicated sets of data. So things are shifting.
I'd also comment on a comment that Cassandra made in her talk a little while ago, and something the gentleman just brought up in a different context. It's really good to be able to come together, not attached to a particular point of view so strongly that you can't really open-mindedly, open-heartedly engage in alternative points of view, which might or might not even be compatible with your own. The question, for example, what role does chaos theory, nonlinear dynamical theory, have in the fundamental understanding of consciousness? One thing we have learned, I think, which I think startling thing that's come out in my mind from M theory, string theory, the attempt, quite successful attempt at this point, to unite the irreconcilable areas of general relativity and quantum mechanics in an attempt essentially to understand, universal mind, is that it is extraordinary how relevant, widely diverse trains of thought are in illuminating this thing that is so big that any point of view is certainly not going to illuminate it, just like no thought can really describe the transcendent wholeness. So, for hundreds of years, mathematicians in their dark offices and their pocket pencil protectors have been devising all kinds of structures of mind that are logically self-consistent and beautiful, but we presumed irrelevant. But all of those, all known mathematical systems, from groups to rings, to sets, to categories, to topos theory and finite sets and infinite sets and topology, differential geometry, every bit of it is essential to fully understand the reality, at least of M theory in its current state. And nobody's going to know all those things. But, if you know several, it's helpful because it's like different facets of a diamond. If you see one, it's shiny. You start to see 4 or 5 or 6, you start to see, well, my gosh, there's an enormous diamond, an enormous reality there. So I honestly believe anything that is mathematically and logically self-consistent, a creation of mind, is going to be important in really illuminating that which can't ultimately be illuminated by any particular angle of pursuit.
Very good, yeah.
I would like to make a comment, and as an education person that's been teaching for many years, several of us are teachers, professors. I find, and probably John who has the same experience, Neil and Rudy, that students are much more open-minded, really, than the professors in many cases. It is an issue. It is an issue that I've been a dean for 10 years. It's an issue to convince faculty bodies to change because they really don't want to change. I mean, this keeping things the way they are, it's a good job. After all your tenure, you don't have to do much. And but the students do want it. And what is happening now with, for example, Jay Kumar, just a little anecdotal situation, is that we're teaching together a course which is basically a dialogue between consciousness and the ancient systems and philosophy with quantum theory and cosmology. And the students love it. We had to do it in a religious department because the science, the college, they said, oh, it's too much. So the religious department seemed to be open, they want it, and then now we're making it a regular general education requirement course that the students can take to fulfill part of their general education. So students are much more open to interdisciplinarity than professors. And as a result, the NSF and the NIH, because that's so tightly connected to departments and traditional disciplines, are finding it very hard to move, although I think NIH has made some great progress, and NSF also is making some great progress. But it is is a struggle, and it will have to come from the students. It really does.
My question was that what happened to the Gaia theory that Earth is a living system? Can we extend that to that whole universe is a living system?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. My question is for Rudy. One of the things that inspires so many of us on this spiritual path that we're in is that it can really help us to overcome or transcend the fear of death. Whatever this supernatural stuff may or may not be, we have seen so many people genuinely, apparently, overcome this fear of death, and in a very, not just in a pacified way, but through illumination and genuine insight, realize that, okay, whatever spiritual truth is beyond. My question is regarding neuroscience and what...
We're not afraid of death.
Sorry. What I see neuroscience helping us to do is to help keep us honest along this way. The things that we think of as irreversible in spiritual realization. What neuroscience is increasingly teaching us is, well, some of the things are they're physical aspects of our brain that are responsible and required for cognitive function. My question is, in your work with people who have various brain neurodegenerative diseases, what are the things, particularly with people who may have had a spiritual practice, that seem to persist even though they have brain damage? And what are the things that are apparently still tied to or connected to the physical aspects of our brain? Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess at one level, you can say, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, it's mainly affecting short-term memory. So you're not keeping track of what's going on over the last few minutes or an hour or later, a few seconds even. So you then kind of go back into your long-term memories and whatever long-term memories you are most passionate about, because memory is really consolidated by emotion. So you remember where you were on 9/11 or when the Challenger shuttle blew up. Emotion really consolidates memory. So these are the long-term memories you remember, your wedding day, your child being born. You revert to these memories. But that's still not helping you with the damage in your brain, stopping you from having short-term memory. So I think the question is, what can we do in our lives besides, keeping a spiritual practice in terms of meditation for the body, yoga, and for the mind, to basically, keep your brain healthy as long as possible. And I think this is, a big area of science now is, this idea of how can we directly affect our own biological transformation every day genetically at the level of neuroplasticity in the brain, so that you're bringing yourself the best possible world. Because in the end, your brain is, you're projecting your own universe. It's yours, and to a large extent, it's your responsibility. So I think it comes down to taking responsibility, using your brain, keeping track of what's going on in terms of the sensations, images, feelings, thoughts your brain's bringing you. Remember that the real you is the observer who's has the gift of this brain, and maybe that will make it last a little longer.
One more?
Is it on? Yeah. I laud this panel. I think this is a wonderful idea. I appreciate the concept of bringing consciousness together from several individuals and interdisciplinary understandings. I'm going to throw in another dimension for all of you. It's one that's been disregarded primarily by conferences like this. It has to do with theosophy, and I'm bringing a new message to the world. There are actually rays of consciousness that create our souls. John, you mentioned dark matter. That's what our soul is, dark matter from stars. That's not something anybody's ever said. But all of those rays of consciousness speak differently. I've talked to some people in the conference and given a different point of view. If you bring those people up here in the fourth, the third, the second, and the sixth and seventh rays of consciousness, you'll get a whole different view. Obama is a seventh ray soul. He's a different kind of human being. Reagan was the last seventh ray president we had. Changed the world forever. We're still dealing with his reality. Those people can make a big difference in the world. Bill Maher is seventh ray consciousness. They're different. You guys are all second ray souls. I'll just tell you that. Not second rate, second ray. I'm second ray also. So just want to let you know. But it'll be fun to add that in. The question is, how do you add in that discipline? I'm one of the few people that can identify that. But that's something that actually is useful. I'll give you an example. Socrates was created by 4 people. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sorry. I won't ask a question then, except that I appreciate what you're doing. I laud the interdisciplinary. Please keep that up, and I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
In your community of minds, I would be the stay-at-home mom that's just curious. So, and I've heard a little bit about what my interest is, which is kind of like the field, which, you know, I don't have scientific background. But Neil's touched on it a little bit about, you know, at the molecular level or the atomic level that, you know, we are all over the place. You know, it's kind of this soup. And then I think that ions, you guys touch on that. And John has touched on it with the astral body and all that sort of stuff. But from what I guess my question is that technology, you know, obviously is becoming exponential and is going to get us very far, but at some point you think that we have to tap into the field for even energy or information, and I really haven't heard that much about it so far. So I'm curious what the panel thinks.
I think that, just a quick comment on that, and it goes back to your question too. You know, in neuroscience, you hear about this brain mapping project, for example. You know, we're really mapping the brain and connections in the brain. We're looking at how neural networks record information, maintain it, associate it, and recall it. But the big question is, where's the information? And we have no idea. And I asked neuroscientists, so where are the memories? When I can recall the feeling I had, I can recall the actual feeling I had when my daughter was born. How's that encoded in fat, water, and protein? How do you do that? And no one can answer it. And even the experiments we do today to understand the brain are describing how the brain records, organizes, categorizes, associates, and recalls. But the reason why I said 500 years, and I'm going to still stick close to that, from the biology perspective, is I don't have a clue about how to find where this information is stored. I can tell you how the brain recalls it and records it. And that's the quandary I have when I think about this stuff.
And I would like to just point out, don't minimize being a stay-at-home mom. I was a stay-at-home mom, and a lot of people have been stay-at-home moms who, you know, go out and do things. Yeah.
Maurizio, do you have one more? Are we done? Okay.
If you have a closing statement, it looks so good, it's all yours.
Well, my goodness. Well, just what that brings up for me, I think the theme for me of this panel again has been this idea of complementarity. There's a physics term that means something very specific, but I mean it in the broader sense of just that the world of consciousness and the field that we're studying and this sort of currently invisible, subtle energy realm is just the other side of the coin of the physical reality of being here in bodies, in relationship with each other, in motherhood, in sex, that is not unreal. And so I always like to, especially as we go to lunch, say that what we're looking at is that handshake. I loved what you said, Julie, about the handshake, that I tend to not go for one as primary and everything is emerging from that, whether it's physical or the non-physical. I tend to be like, we're clearly in this incarnation in some sort of dance that we are working to understand. That's my final thought. Anyone else? Okay, thank you for being here. Thank you.